Pleasure to be here with Professor Barry Scott Wimpfheimer, who is Associate Professor for Religious Studies and Law at Northwestern University, the author of Narrating the Law, A Poetics of Talmudic Legal Stories, and just recently, his new book from 2018, The Talmud, a Biography, won a National Jewish Book Award. So mazel tov on that. Yeah.
Thank you, Shmuly.
Thanks.
Happy to be here.
Good. So I'd love to hear, I know you're working on a book on Halakhah now. I'd love to hear more about what that's about.
So for a long time, I've wanted to write a book about Halakhah, and one of the major motivating factors is that I feel like Halakhah is often misunderstood. Part of the problem is that I think that people have a categorical misperception of what Halakhah is.
Yeah. Beautiful. So can you tell us about that most common misperception?
Yeah, so I think that people generally think of Halakhah, and this is not just a problem in the Jewish context, it's a problem with law in general. Right. People think of law as a singular entity, and they think of it that way because it sometimes presents itself that way, and it makes it seem as though it's a singular entity. If you go to an American court and you want some adjudication, so both sides, if there's a competitive situation, both sides are going to argue the law says that I am right. So the part of the rhetoric and the practice of what you're doing is to present law as if it's a singular thing, where you can calculate what the result is, and it'll tell you this is what you should do. And so people have this impression of law in general. They have this impression of Halakhah, and to some extent, for people who are inside the system, some of that is true. There is an element of that. But I think if you pan out, if you zoom out a little bit, you can see that there's a much greater subtlety and complexity, both to law in general and specifically to Halakhah. And I wanted to try to redescribe Jewish law by correcting what I see to be misconceptions, while still kind of keeping it together.
Yeah. So what would the alternative be? If it's not a singular entity that is monolithic and objective, what does this alternative model look like, and where can we access that spoken about that in that kind of way?
So in this new project I'm working on, I actually have to decide, okay, where am I going to start? Where am I going to start Jewish law from? And one of the things I decide to do is I decide to start the Jewish law from the Mishnah rather than from the Torah, which isn't because I think that the Bible isn't foundational to Jewish law, but I think there are certain things that happen in the Mishnah as a document in terms of how it sets up future Jewish law. It inaugurates a way of describing law as a really rich but coherent organizing narrative or framework for life. And I think it's as a result of the Mishnah and the density of the Mishnah that later Halakhah becomes as rich as it does. So I actually start from the Mishnah and I take it to the present. And what I'm trying to do is for the materials that we have, our access is primarily literary, like ancient materials or medieval materials. I want to use the most sophisticated literary tools to bring out and tease out ambiguities of meaning and other kinds of subtle nuances of interpretation to flesh out the variety that's inherent. And then when we get to the modern period, I'm planning on doing a little bit more archival work and biographic work to think about modern figures about whom we have more information. We aren't limited to just what they wrote. We can do all other kinds of biographical work to talk about what I consider to be the subjective construction of law. That I think that individuals encounter the law, whether they're the ones making it, or they're the ones interpreting it or enforcing it, or they're the ones who are violating it knowingly or not knowingly. Like, there's all kinds of subjective relationships with the law, and because so much of Halakhah is produced by scholars, the scholastic construction of law is such a very important part of what we think of when we talk about Halakhah.
Right. So what does that look like for a layperson? A layperson who finds it compelling to engage with the halakhic system, but is not necessarily a scholar. How does their experience of engaging with halakha change in the more subjective model?
So, I think that in my early book, Narrating the Law, what I was trying to articulate was a view of law that is much closer to narrative, and to try to push that view all the way back into the Talmud itself, and to point out that within the Talmud itself you can prioritize stories about the law, and if you do that as opposed to simpler rules, you get a more complex picture of what lived halacha is, where halacha isn't just like a set of principles, but it's a field of thinking, it's a discourse, and it's in dialogue with. It's in dialogue with medicine, and it's in dialogue with popular culture, and it's in dialogue with ethics and other kinds of philosophical values, and it becomes, as a discourse, a framing way of producing meaning in life, but it doesn't have to be the definitive source of meaning in your life, and it could be a lot richer if it's open to including ideas that are coming from other
So those engaged in a halachic system often find themselves in a dilemma, and typically they, what at least in the traditional world one would do, as you know, either I'm going to call my rabbi, or I'm going to open the Shulchan Aruch, I'm going to open a sefer, I'm going to open a book, as opposed to saying, what are the more complex dynamics at play here? In regards to one's emotional intelligence, the ethical implications, right? What's sort of alive in that moment? And I think what you're trying to say is we kind of want to breathe life back in to the I'm using my words, not yours.
Sure.
The existential, ethical moment, perhaps even spiritual moment that actually makes this encounter real, as opposed to just exporting it back in time to a situation which has some objective answer, but is not at all relevant to this real moment, right? Does that line up at all with what you're talking about?
No, it totally lines up. And I'll say, the typical situation now, a new issue comes up, some kind of technological thing that we haven't seen before, virtual reality, who knows what the issue is, right? And so within traditional circles, and by this I don't just mean Orthodox circles, I mean conservative circles, places where Halakhah is a textual discourse that people take it seriously. The tendency is to, let's find the relevant sources that we can mine that can give us guidance in dealing with this kind of new issue. But there's an act of submission that's happening when you approach those sources expecting a calculus or a calculation that's going to give you an end result. Instead of thinking about halacha as a framework of meaning that has sets of values that can be very valuable in thinking about all kinds of modern issues, but might be limited and might need to be updated in light of the new realities of the way we live. And one of the new realities of the way we live, because you asked about how a layperson, is that many more people are educated, and even if they're not educated in terms of their halachic knowledge at the level of a rabbi, they're educated in terms of their general knowledge, some of whom may be more educated than the rabbis they're approaching for their advice. So years ago I gave a talk at a Jofa conference once called Rabbi May I, taking responsibility for Psak in a post-feminist age, where I talked about how, in this educated age, where we're all modern people and we take greater autonomy for determining our lives, one of the things that happens is we get to weigh the factors. We have enough of an education to understand what the result is when the rabbi tells you X, and to weigh that against the other values. The funny thing about it is that when I was done with the lecture, a woman raised her hand and she said, "Rabbi, I've always been frustrated by second day holiday. I don't think it makes sense anymore in this day and age, in light of the calendar and technology. And I don't think we need to keep second day holiday anymore. I don't want to keep second day holiday anymore. What do you think?" And I said, well, based on what I just said, if I'm being consistent, you are an intelligent person and you've gotten all the information. If you want to make that decision, that is your responsibility. That makes your decision even more meaningful because you're the one who's choosing it. But she wouldn't let it go, and she was like, "No, but I want you to give me permission to say that." So, there's a tension because people are still trained to think that halakhah is something that other people have to take responsibility for.
Right. So what I hear you saying is also that in moving towards autonomy, to actualize one's own intentional, deliberative, moral, spiritual lives, we're also challenging an authority-based understanding of law, and that's not insignificant. And so I wonder what that looks like in secular law today. Are there judges or legal theorists in secular law today who are saying, it's not enough just to quote a Moshe Feinstein or an Avadia Yosef and then done, right? Actually, so too, we don't just need a legal precedence to demonstrate that in the 70s someone said this, but actually our moral intuition, our sense of reason, our sense of the common good is enough for us to go in a certain direction. And is that a minority of legal theorists today and of legal practitioners?
So, in legal scholarship, particularly in the United States, there has been a real reaction towards the heyday of legal liberalism. So there was like a heyday of legal liberalism, let's say starting in the 60s, 60s till the 80s, and then since the 80s there have been a number of different thinkers who have questioned whether liberalism is really enough, because for some of the similar reasons, and it's partly because individuals are often encountering the law in very different ways. So people of color and other discriminated minorities encounter the law, and by the law I mean not just the scholastic part of it, but also the mechanism arm, the enforcement arm, the imprisonment arm. And so there's a lot of legal scholarship that seeks to undermine the fundamental trust in the authority and the fundamentally liberalizing tendencies of the court system. In our current age, with the transformation of the Supreme Court, there's probably going to be even more cynicism because the Supreme Court has become overtly politicized. There's going to be even more cynicism towards that. And so there are scholars. One of the scholars whose work really influences me on the subjective notion of law is Jack Balkin at Yale, and then there's Pierre Schlag at the University of Colorado, who's all about needing to critique law as reason. And people, for a long time, there's like this assumption that law is reasonable and rational, and if we just work within our legal materials, we're going to produce a good result. But that isn't always true.
Right. So one of the things I see consistently drawn upon, both in Halakhah and secular law, is this original intent, right? As opposed to consequentialism. Like, actually, what's the moral consequences of the rules we're imposing here? So I wonder, when does that intellectual shift happen? In intellectual history, this notion that the law is the singular entity, when does that happen? And what would have to be recovered just before that shift?
This is one of the big questions that I guess I'm still trying to sort out myself. I think that modernity, this is sort of the end part of this project that I'm working on, where I'm thinking about how Roman law becomes very highly studied in Germany, and then the German legal scholars are interested in constructing German law as national law. And you see law being studied as connected to certain nationalist movements, and even in the United States, with the rise of federal law over state law and the importance of that, that tendency towards unification and federation is probably a 20th century phenomenon. And then because we live in that world, we just take it for granted that this is the assumption people make about law. Like, if we could take a time machine back into halakhic history, we now get to look at all of our responsa on the Bar Ilan project. We have access to them at our fingertips. But there was a period of time where you didn't have access to any responsa. So that variety was completely lost. But at the same time, like, your local rabbi had tremendous flexibility, because there wasn't a check against all of the other versions of halakhah that were out there. So, modernity has given us a lot more of a picture of the variety, but at the same time, it has sort of confined us into a notion that it's unified.
Right. So my last question for you, and I know you're more in the world, obviously, of theory than of field practice, but what would the social impact be of creating a shift like this, or what would you like it to be?
I'd like it for people to. I think that living a halakhic life is an incredibly meaningful thing for people, but there's a lot of people out there who, for a variety of reasons, and reasons that I completely respect and admire, don't connect with halakhah often because of what halakhah has to say about them personally, or about their subcategory of person in society. If we make halakhah more subtle, complex, and flexible, then we create more space within halachic community for different varieties of observance and also different interactions that make halakhah meaningful. I think halakhah can be an incredibly powerful and meaningful way for people to live, and it's one of the beautiful things about the Jewish tradition is that we have this tradition. Halakhah is one of the major benefits of Judaism, but we've alienated too many people by having a kind of rigid and singular definition of what halakhah is. So.
I think you're right. I think the term itself, among most liberal Jews, in the broadest sense, I mean, in America, certainly in Israel, is understood as the most alienating of terms. This is a closed system where old men, primarily ultra-Orthodox, with all respect to them, are trying to push people out. Essentially, that's so the sense of empowerment of one's autonomy and intellectual reason and engagement in a broader sense, I think, is an incredibly important enterprise. So. Thank you for this time.
Thank you.
And I encourage folks to check out Narrating the Law, Poetics of Talmudic Legal Stories, the Talmud Biography, again, Mazel Tov on the award. And what's the name of the Halakhah book you're working on now? Or is there a name yet?
Working title is There a Jewish Law?
Okay. Fascinating. Okay, for the next interview, we'll talk about that.